The night in the Wild West brought no peace. It was a time when the boundaries between civilization and the wild were blurred, and the darkness hid not only predators, but also people whose intentions were far from good. An isolated settler's cabin, lit by a lone fire in the middle of the endless prairie, became a vulnerable spot in an ocean of darkness. Survival in such conditions did not depend on luck or the number of weapons. It was the result of a carefully thought-out system where every detail mattered, from the crunch of gravel underfoot to the location of a window in the wall. These defense methods, honed over generations, turned a modest dwelling into an impregnable fortress. Watch the video to the end to learn how a simple light trap could blind and disorient attackers, and why an experienced settler would pick up a regular flashlight instead of a rifle at a crucial moment. The defense began not at the walls of the house, but 100 meters away from it. The first step was to create a clear zone around the hut. All trees, tall bushes, and even large boulders were ruthlessly removed to deprive the attackers of natural cover. This created an open space that had to be crossed under potential observation from the house. Any movement in this area became noticeable. Psychologically, this changed the balance of power, making the aggressor feel vulnerable even as they approached. Particular attention was paid to blind spots, areas that could not be seen from the windows. The terrain was carefully studied and, where possible, leveled. Any hollow or hill that could hide a person was considered a serious threat. The paths leading to the house were never straight. They were deliberately made winding, forcing anyone approaching to change direction several times. This slowed down movement and gave the defenders more time to react. Even the height of the grass mattered. Around the house, it was regularly mowed or burned. Tall grass could hide a person crawling, so its absence was an important element of passive security. At night, this clear area became a stage lit by the moon and stars. Any dark silhouette against this backdrop became an obvious target. Attackers lost their main advantage, the element of surprise. Creating such a perimeter was a laborious process that took weeks, but every hour spent clearing the area paid off in hours of peaceful sleep. It was an investment in safety that was more important than a high fence. This approach required a deep understanding of the terrain and the psychology of the attacker. The settlers learned to think like their enemies in order to predict their actions. Each tree was left or removed for a specific purpose. Over time, a real exclusion zone formed around the hut. It was a space where the owner dictated the rules. Anyone who entered it without permission was automatically considered a threat. It is interesting to consider how these methods compare to modern electronic security systems. Which do you think is more effective? A clear field and a keen eye, or a surveillance camera and a motion sensor? Please share your thoughts on this. When visual control weakened with the onset of darkness, defense based on hearing came to the fore. Settlers turned their yards into a giant alarm system. Any careless step was bound to make noise. The paths leading to doors and windows were covered with gravel, broken stones, or dry branches. It was practically impossible to walk on such a surface without making a sound. The characteristic crunch instantly alerted the inhabitants of the house to the approach of someone. A strip of dry leaves or specially scattered straw was often left under the windows. Even the most experienced climber could not cross it without making a sound. This simple method worked more effectively than any modern alarm system. A more complex system was tripwires made of thin wire or rope. They were stretched at ankle level in the most unexpected places. A bundle of empty tin cans or a small bell was attached to the end of the tripwire. The location of these traps was constantly changing. This was done so that a constant observer could not study and memorize their location. Every week, the tripwires were moved, creating new routes with surprises. Sometimes larger acoustic barriers were used. A shallow trench could be dug around the entire perimeter and filled with dry brush. Any attempt to cross it would create a loud crackling sound that could be heard from a great distance. Poultry kept in the yard also served as an excellent alarm system. Geese and turkeys would start honking loudly at the appearance of any stranger. Their agitation was a reliable alarm signal. Fences and barriers were built with noise in mind. The top edge of the fence was often left with thin, loosely nailed boards. Any attempt to climb over it inevitably caused creaking and banging. Even the location of the woodshed or other outbuildings was important. They were placed so as to create acoustic corridors that amplified the sound of footsteps. The entire yard became a resonator, picking up the slightest noises. This multi-level system of sound traps prevented attackers from approaching unnoticed. It deprived them of the element of surprise and gave the defenders precious seconds. During this time, they could take up defensive positions. But what if the attackers knew about these traps and moved with extreme caution? For this case, there was the next level of defense, based not on sound, but on light. Watch until the end to find out how the settlers used fire and shadow to their advantage. At night, light was not only a source of comfort, but also a powerful tactical weapon. Experienced settlers knew that a single lantern, used correctly, could be more effective than a gun. The main principle was to control visibility, both their own and that of their enemies. They never lit all the windows in the house. Usually there was a single candle or kerosene lamp burning in one room, such as the kitchen. This created the illusion that the whole family was there and unaware of any danger. In reality, it was a trap. While the lit room attracted the attention of the attackers, the family was in the next room, which was completely dark. From there, through special viewing slits, they could observe the yard while remaining invisible. The human eye, accustomed to darkness, sees much better than an eye blinded by light. The attackers, looking at the illuminated window, could not see anything that was happening in the surrounding darkness. The defenders, on the other hand, being in the dark, could clearly see the silhouettes against the background of the illuminated area. Sometimes the lantern was deliberately placed on the windowsill, turning it into a decoy. It was the perfect target for the first shot. While the attacker was aiming at the lantern, he revealed his location with the flash of a shot. Another technique involved the use of a portable lantern with a shutter. The defender could open the shutter for a split second, blinding the attacker with a bright flash of light. This was enough to disorient the enemy and make an accurate shot. Bright light completely destroys night vision. It takes several minutes to recover. In the fast-paced night combat, those minutes were equivalent to an eternity. That is why an experienced settler might prefer a lantern to a rifle. By blinding a group of attackers, he gained a huge tactical advantage. Disoriented people became easy targets. Inside the house, darkness was also controlled. All family members knew the location of the furniture by heart and could move around in complete darkness without making a sound. Any outsider who broke into a dark room would be helpless. In this way, the settlers turned darkness from a threat into an ally. They used light sparingly and strategically to see themselves, but not to let the enemy see them. It was an art that required composure and an understanding of human physiology. The hut itself was the last line of defense. Its construction was designed to withstand a direct attack. It was not just a building to live in, but a real bastion. The thick log walls were good protection in themselves. Bullets from most guns of the time would get stuck in the thick wood. Stone or adobe houses were even more reliable. The windows were the most vulnerable spot, so special attention was paid to them. They were small and located higher than usual. This made it difficult to penetrate and aim from the outside. At night, the windows were closed from the inside with massive wooden shutters. These shutters were made of thick boards and locked with a heavy beam. They were capable of withstanding not only gunshots, but also axe blows. Small loopholes were often cut into the shutters and walls. They were almost invisible from the outside, but allowed fire to be directed from the inside. The location of the loopholes was calculated to provide crossfire on the approaches to the house. The door was the strongest part of the house. It was made of 2 layers of oak boards fastened with forged nails. Sometimes sheet iron was laid between the layers. The door was locked not with a lock, but with a massive wooden beam that was inserted into grooves in the wall. It was practically impossible to break down such a door. The hinges were made of wrought iron and were deeply embedded in the door jamb. The chimney was another potential route of entry. Therefore, it was made narrow and with several bends. Sometimes a grate was installed at the top of the pipe. The roof was also taken into account in the defense. It was made with a steep slope so that it would be difficult to hold on to. The attic had its own loopholes for firing at attackers from above. All these measures turned a simple hut into a serious fortification. Attempting to storm such a house was an extremely risky undertaking. The defenders were in a much more advantageous position, but fortifying the walls was only half the battle. In the next chapter, we will examine how the interior layout of the house became the last line of defense. The interior of the house was organized with the possibility of an attack in mind. The layout of the rooms and the arrangement of the furniture turned the dwelling into a deadly trap. Every piece of furniture had a defensive purpose. The furniture was massive and heavy. In case of danger, tables, chests, and cabinets were quickly moved to create internal barricades. These improvised shelters could stop attackers who had already broken into the house. The doors between rooms were not aligned, but arranged in a checkerboard pattern. This made it impossible to shoot through the house. Attackers had to clear each room separately, wasting time and suffering losses. The staircase to the second floor or attic was always narrow and steep. It became an ideal position for defense. One defender from above could hold off several opponents trying to climb up. There could be hidden passages or hatches in the walls between rooms. They allowed defenders to move around the house unnoticed. It was possible to leave the room that was being stormed and appear behind the attackers. Floors were often made with special squeaky boards in key places. The owners knew their location and avoided them, while any outsider would give themselves away with a squeak. It was another home alarm system. The house always had a supply of water and sand. They were intended not only for domestic needs, but also for extinguishing fires. Attempted arson was one of the most common methods of attack. The sleeping quarters were located in the most protected parts of the house. These were usually rooms without windows or on the second floor. This ensured maximum safety during sleep. The house had several hiding places for weapons and ammunition. Even if the attackers captured one room, the defenders could arm themselves in another. Weapons were scattered throughout the house. Thus, even breaking through did not mean victory for the attackers. They found themselves in a pre-prepared labyrinth where every corner hid danger. The defenders, on the other hand, were in their element, knowing all the traps and hiding places. Even the most sophisticated traps and fortifications were useless without a vigilant observer. Therefore, the organization of guard duty was the basis of nighttime security. Sleeping as a family at the same time was an unaffordable luxury. The family established a strict schedule of duties. Adult family members, including women, took turns standing guard. Usually the watch lasted 2 to 3 hours, after which the guard was changed. This allowed the rest to get a good night's sleep. A tired person loses vigilance and can make mistakes. Therefore, rest was as important as staying awake. The observation post was usually located in the darkest room. The guard sat in a chair by the window or peephole. He was not allowed to move or make any noise so as not to give himself away. Each person on duty had a simple system for raising the alarm. This could be a cord leading to a bell in the bedroom or a code knock on the wall. The signal had to be quiet for outsiders, but understandable for those on duty. Dogs were indispensable assistants in guard duty. Their keen hearing and sense of smell detected approaching danger long before a human could notice it. A dog's quiet growl was the most reliable alarm signal. Standing guard was a monotonous and psychologically difficult task. Sitting in the dark for hours, listening to every rustle, required tremendous endurance. It was a test of fortitude and discipline. To stay awake, those on duty resorted to various tricks. They would chew dried berries or splash cold water on their faces. The main task was to stay focused until the end of the shift. The guard schedule was an unbreakable law. It was observed even in the worst weather. A blizzard or thunderstorm could provide cover for an attack, and on such nights, vigilance was doubled. This system ensured that the house was never left unprotected. At any given moment, at least one person was ready to repel a threat. It was a collective responsibility for overall safety. What do you think was the most difficult task for the night watch? And how did they cope with the psychological stress? In the next chapter, we will learn about the settler's invisible helpers. An experienced settler viewed the surrounding landscape not as a set of obstacles, but as part of his defense system. Every hill, ravine, or stream could be either a hiding place for the enemy or an advantage for the defender. Proper use of the terrain doubled the reliability of the defense. Houses were never built in low-lying areas. The ideal location was a gentle hillside or a small hill. This provided a good view of the surrounding area and made it difficult to approach unnoticed. If there was a stream or river nearby, the house was built at a distance from the water. The banks were often overgrown, providing good cover. In addition, The murmur of water could drown out the sound of approaching footsteps. The forest near the house presented a dual threat. On the one hand, it provided firewood and game. On the other hand, it was an ideal place for an ambush. Therefore, the settlers carefully thinned the forest on the approaches to the house. They created clearings and corridors that were easily visible. Anyone moving through the forest was forced to cross these open areas. The ravines and gullies near the dwelling also required attention. They tried to make their slopes more precipitous. Sometimes barricades of thorny branches were set up at the bottom of the ravine. Natural barriers, such as rocky outcrops or swampy areas, were integrated into the overall defense system. Trails were laid out to bypass these areas from the side that was advantageous to the defenders. The settlers knew their land well in all seasons. They remembered where the snow lay longer, where gullies formed in the spring, and where the ground dried out and became dusty in the summer. All this knowledge was used to predict the possible routes of attackers. Even the direction of the prevailing winds was taken into account. Knowing where the wind was blowing from, it was possible to predict which side would be better for hearing sounds. This helped to position acoustic traps correctly. Thus, the defensive line was not along the walls of the house, but along the boundaries of the studied and mastered territory. The settler was the master not only of his plot, but of the entire surrounding landscape. This gave him a huge advantage. The question of weapons was key, but the approach to it was purely pragmatic. It was not a matter of the number of guns, but of their correct selection, condition, and location. Weapons had to be ready for battle at any moment. The settler's main weapon was a large caliber smoothbore shotgun. It was versatile and could fire both bullets and shot. Shot was particularly effective at short ranges against a group of attackers. Rifles were more accurate but also more expensive. They were used for aimed shooting at long distances. Such weapons were usually carried by the head of the family, the most experienced marksman. Revolvers and pistols served as weapons of last resort. They were used for indoor combat, where long-barreled rifles were inconvenient. Women often had their own revolver hidden in an accessible place. Ammunition was stored with particular care. Gunpowder was kept in a dry place, in hermetically sealed horns. Bullets and shot were cast independently in spare time. The ammunition supply was always large. The calculation was simple. It was better to have 100 more cartridges than one less. Saving on ammunition could cost lives. Weapons were never stored in one place. Each room had its own arsenal. It could be a loaded shotgun standing in the corner or a revolver lying in a desk drawer. This dispersal ensured that defenders would always have access to weapons. Even if one part of the house was captured, the defense could continue in another. All family members knew exactly where the nearest weapon was located. The weapons were kept in perfect condition. They were regularly cleaned and lubricated. Loaded weapons were checked every day. In addition to firearms, there were always cold weapons: axes, heavy knives, pitchforks. In close combat, any of these items could be deadly. They were placed near doors and windows, always within reach. Thus, the house was not only fortified, but also saturated with weapons. Each of its defenders was ready for battle. This made an assault an extremely dangerous undertaking for the attackers. In addition to active defense, settlers also used passive defense methods based on deception. The main task was to make their huts less attractive targets for attack. Sometimes the best battle is the one that is avoided. Settlers tried not to show off their wealth. They did not display expensive utensils or clothing. From the outside, the house had to look modest and even poor. Rumors of poverty and misfortune could be spread deliberately. In conversations with rare traders or travelers, the owner might complain about crop failures or livestock deaths. This created a reputation as an unprofitable target. Sometimes more active methods of misinformation were used. For example, several false abandoned trails could be created leading away from the house. This could confuse those who were watching. In some cases, settlers created the appearance that there were many more people living in the house than there actually were. In the evening, they could light up different buildings and make noise to imitate conversations. This caused attackers to overestimate the strength of the defenders. Footprints around the house could also be used to deceive. Several pairs of large men's boots could be left leading from the house and back. This created the impression that there were several adult men in the house. During long absences, tricks could be used to simulate presence. For example, a rag could be tied to the chimney, which would create the illusion of smoke in the wind. Partially open shutters also indicated that the house was inhabited. A dog left with neighbors during the owner's absence could be brought back to the yard at night. Its barking created the impression that the owners were at home. It was a simple but effective way to deceive. Sometimes traces of a recent camp were deliberately left near the house. This could create the impression that a group of armed men had stopped nearby. Potential attackers preferred not to take any chances. All these methods were aimed at influencing the decision to attack. By making the enemy doubt it was possible to avoid a direct confrontation. Psychological warfare was no less important than real warfare. Even a successfully repelled attack was not the end, but the beginning of important work. Each attack was carefully analyzed to identify weaknesses in the defense and improve it. The experience gained in battle was the most valuable knowledge. Immediately after the danger had passed, the area was inspected. The defenders looked for any traces left by the attackers, the places where they hid, their routes of approach and retreat. All this was marked on a makeshift map. They determined which traps had worked and which had not. If the attackers managed to bypass any of the tripwires, its location was deemed unsuccessful. Next time, it was placed in a different location, taking into account the information obtained. The actions of the defenders themselves were analyzed. They discussed who did what and how, which decisions were correct, and where mistakes were made. It was a frank conversation, without recriminations, aimed at improving teamwork. All fortifications were checked. Traces of bullets on the walls and shutters were searched for, and the strength of the door was checked. Any damage was immediately repaired, and weak spots were further reinforced. If the attackers managed to get close to the house from a certain side, that sector was considered the most dangerous. In the future, surveillance of that sector was increased. Perhaps additional shelters were removed or more traps were set there. The effectiveness of the fire was assessed. The defenders recalled from which positions the shooting was most successful. These firing points became the main ones in the defense plan. Ammunition supplies were immediately replenished. Used cartridges were replaced with new ones. Weapons were thoroughly cleaned and brought to full combat readiness. Information about the attack was passed on to neighbors whenever possible. The number of attackers, their tactics, and their weapons were described. This exchange of information helped the entire settlement to be prepared for new threats. In this way, the defense system constantly evolved. It was not static, but adapted to new challenges. Each repelled attack made the hut even more impregnable and its defenders more experienced. We can see that nighttime defense in the Wild West was a complex, multi-layered science. It was a system where psychology, knowledge of the terrain, engineering solutions, and iron discipline came together. Survival was not a matter of chance, but the result of constant work and vigilance. From the cleared perimeter to the loaded rifle in every room, everything was part of a single plan. These people turned their homes into fortresses and the darkness into their ally. Their experience is a harsh but important lesson in how a person can ensure their own safety by relying on their own wits and foresight. Many of these principles, perimeter control, creating dead zones, light management, are still relevant today, albeit in a different technological form. Which of the settlers' defense methods did you find most ingenious or unexpected? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the mysteries of the past.